So people obviously this last year and a half have kind of claimed that WWE creatively has been real bad. Kind of a lot of people have even given the hyperbole that, it's been one of the worst years like since Vince. I don't really think so. I think there's always going to be a kind of a baseline now, standard that we kind of have ever since 2022 with Triple H. But I will say we obviously aren't at the creative peaks that we were in 2023 to 2024. And I kind of want to look at why that is. It seems the biggest thing, in my opinion, is that there's a lack of a central storyline. The big bloodline storyline that essentially dominated 2023, 2024, and a little bit of 2025 is probably the biggest reason for WWE's success, and not necessarily the fact that that one storyline was what was bringing in all the eyes, but the way everything kind of worked around this system of having essentially a long-term standing narrative where there's essentially a hierarchy of characters. In terms of that, you had people interacting with each other still within this rule set essentially of what was going on at the time. That's why I think a lot of people were interested in the rise of the Judgment Day. With the bloodline happening, you had Cody's kind of trajectory up as well. You had Gunther as well with Imperium doing his work. It's because you had a lot of long-term storylines essentially with all these characters. That's not just something that was part of the bloodline. You had obviously Gunther, like if you look at the Mania that year, Gunther was constantly feuding with Sheamus and Drew and essentially most of the mid-card to bring prestige to the IC title, which was the whole story of that year essentially, right? Which involved people like Chad Gable, involved a bunch of people like Otis and a lot of the people in the mid-card who didn't really have a chance to show talent. Now that Gunther was a big boss mid-card guy, you kind of had that opportunity a lot of the times too for him to put on bangers and really add to that title reign, which is now legendary. Kind of look at the IC title now, for example. While Dominic does have it, and there have been a couple of storylines and matches that have highlighted that IC title kind of post winning it off of Cena, which you would have thought would have been now the launching pad to have an amazing reign. He hasn't really done anything with the title because there's a lack of focus obviously on storytelling and continuity right now in the WWE, and that's I think the biggest problem that's kind of plagued them. If you look at the build of WrestleMania 41 even, for example, by this point in time we had multiple stories kind of set in stone that each week we were progressing in, with Jay winning the Royal Rumble, for example, right? And then challenging Gunther immediately. We had the gauntlet that Gunther was putting Jay through that eventually, we had those crazy segments where Gunther was beating Jimmy blood to a bloody pulp, and then Jay had to essentially bring out some of his best promos and most ruthlessness like persona that we've ever seen to eventually climb that mountain and defeat Gunther, which in itself another legendary story, and notching the belt for Jey Uso as a single star and legitimized, as well as Gunther being the big bad, and there's always going to be that one thing that people can kind of harp on him on, which they do now, even in his indestructible wake right now that he's doing. Another kind of example is even look at the Judgment Day, right? I mean, I think there's still some inklings of obviously long-term progression in terms of the relationship between Roxanne and Liv, for example, but there hasn't been any payoffs necessarily compared to when we had the tension boiling between obviously Damian Priest, Finn, and Rhea and the rest of the Judgment Day, and that was in point of making both Damian Priest and Rhea Ripley stars, right? There was a focal point to the story that was happening. Whereas right now, there is no, for example, for the Judgment Day, right? While we have Roxanne, you would think Roxanne being added would mean that there's a tag team push maybe, or some sort of thing like that. But no, it's been more teasing and kind of backpedaling in terms of, oh, now that Roxanne is here, what is the dynamic between Liv and Raquel? And instead of genuinely exploring that, we've just kind of had, we've taken a backseat in terms of the nuance that would happen during Judgment Day segments, for example. There's a whole point and period of time where the tension between, JD Damian and Finn was going to boil over, you know, and similarly, they seem to be trying to do something similar with Finn and Dom, but because of the lack of presence of Dom, there hasn't been enough time to build up the tension of eventually Finn and Dom splitting up. Similar to how in the Bloodline, right, there was always tension between each of the characters because each week there was a new action taken that then changes the dynamic and relationship between these characters. This hasn't been happening really in the main roster in consistency for a while, and that's what I think people are kind of annoyed about. If we look at kind of what happened obviously with the John Cena heel turn, for example, one of the biggest focal points of the year essentially for 2025, that was kaput essentially the moment John kind of came back on Raw and then had a heel promo that didn't acknowledge what just happened. Now there's already a disconnect, right? There's already a disconnect in terms of storytelling, continuity, and what the rules that are being set. How well the wrestling immerses itself and respects its own rules. Because a lot of times, especially in the WWE recently, a lot of those rules are thrown out the window, right? So then we're left kind of with a lack of finality and storytelling that happened. I mean, look at how they've booked John Cena's retirement tour. There wasn't really a story going into any of it, essentially. It was just literally the dates, and he would come out, you know, and essentially the attrition of John Cena existing is what by proxy brought other people to then want to feud. The whole idea of him wanting to destroy wrestling, right, and take the belt back, the fans obviously didn't care and were pushing back on that every single week. Instead of really just kind of turning the point immediately, they kept with it and kept being kind of stubborn in terms of keeping Cena heel, especially for the Orton match and the CM Punk match, which they were super fun matches. But imagine we got the Cena who was working in that latter half, that had that Cody match with him at SummerSlam, that had that AJ Styles match, that had that amazing Logan Paul match and the Dominic match, you know, and the Sami Zayn match. That would have been a lot more compelling, and there would have been a lot more to chew on promo wise, because John Cena, at the end of the day, his character has not been heel. I do think the idea of the relationship with the fans being toxic is absolutely wonderful and perfect, but I don't think at this point in his career we would buy that, because it's a lie. And I mean, they even themselves went back on their word essentially, and eventually Cena, with I guess a stern talking to from Cody, essentially turned face again, which then illustrates the problem of a lack of not only integrity in their own storytelling, but no forethought or planning in terms of where they wanted to go with things, right? Because, you know, it does feel like a lot of pivots instead of like a cohesive, solid narrative that the Bloodline, the rise and the fall in the Bloodline was. And they love to constantly talk about how Emmy worthy and everything that was. Just like, what is it that about the WWE that they feel they cannot put together a coherent long-term narrative like that again? You know, that's kind of what my question is right now, because obviously, right, that it fell through with John Cena, The Rock, and Travis Scott, right? And, you know, beyond that narrative, there hasn't really been a lot of long-term narratives throughout the year. The only other one is genuinely Gunther as the career killer, you know, and that has been obviously an extreme highlight of the year, you know, but that once again is something that comparatively to the Bloodline, or comparatively to his even IC title reign, has not been as nuanced and as focused on. It's a lot of, it seems like, booking to a specific arena in the moment of time, instead of, you know, doing that but also serving your stories moving forward. And it feels like in 2025 we've had a lot of examples of booking to a place or booking to an area without really thinking about whatever is going to happen next. I look at the Finn CM Punk stuff, look at, you know, CM Punk defending against AJ randomly, right? You know, a lot of the things here don't necessarily feel bad, but they feel extremely contrived because of how easily predictable they are. And the problem also becomes when then they blame us for being too perceptive, when in reality it's just bad writing. The whole Seth Rollins injury angle doesn't hit because the whole time, the way everything is being done, right? We're not sitting here discussing and talking about the intricacies and what's happening within story. We're talking about everything outside of wrestling, which then influences how the storyline plays out. It's like, for example, if a character dies in Game of Thrones, for example, and then all of a sudden they start tweeting and stuff like that, like, oh, I'm not really dead, it was just a weird like contract thing that kind of screwed me over, and then the character essentially comes back in the show, and you're going, well, we didn't really get a justification in the show for why the person's back, but we got a bunch of tweets signifying, I guess, that this person's alive. Like, I know it's a weird comparison, but wrestling is unique in that it leverages on the rumor and gossip about how it's created to then leverage and create like moments. But I think at its worst, you get what you get right now, where it's like, yeah, like y'all, like they'll tell us to be complacent with what's happening, but genuinely y'all can do a lot better. There could be a lot more nuance in storytelling. We can have not necessarily something that isn't predictable, because once again, Cody Rhodes won the Royal Rumble twice, right? But we weren't hating on that because it served the story. It served the narrative going forward. It felt natural, right? Whereas right now, a lot of what's happening in WWE doesn't feel necessarily natural, but contrived for the sake of, obviously building an event. But that shouldn't be something that's obvious to us. That should resonate in excitement for the product and not necessarily meticulous criticism of what could have done better. And that points to, you could be doing better, and I think obviously Triple H and WWE's response to kind of thumb up their nose at fans instead of just going, hey, maybe, we should spruce things up and kind of see what we can do down the line in terms of like, making really fun stories and getting better at storytelling. I think we need another kind of we need more long-term stories similar to the Bloodline. We need to be focusing on characters. We need to be developing people. I think a great highlight of 2025, for example, was Maxine Dupree and kind of the whole women's IC title run. I think Lyra, I should even go further back. I think Lyra kind of being the inaugural champion, and then Becky coming in and having that whole program with her has legitimized Lyra extremely, and then further down the line with Maxine and Becky, another great thorough line. Unfortunately, though, it does seem like after that, Lyra went on to kind of be in a tag team vortex with Bayley. But there was some bright spots in 25 that I do wish they kept focusing on. It just did seem like there were so many pivots, and it reminded me kind of in that regard of Vince era kind of stuff, because instead of really thinking about the whole foundation of everything, it was about the pop for a night. And when you constantly chase the pop for a night, I think you get where you are now, this complacency, we have to rise ticket prices, we have to do everything so that the gates are the biggest they ever were, because there isn't as much as a demand to see everybody, because let's be honest, there isn't. That peak that happened in that 2024, it's because of the culmination of multiple stories that have seen a decent build and a bunch of pay-per-view matches. That didn't happen this year, in 2025 and 2026, except for literally Gunther and a few others, I think, especially. Even in terms of what Roman and Cody have done this year. Cody has been defending the WWE title until he lost it recently, but there wasn't really any narrative moving forward about him holding on to that title and kind of losing his mind, because even when he then did eventually lose it to Drew, like right now, there hasn't been any change or dissension in character. It's just now we're back on the chase as face Cody Rhodes. There hasn't been any change in the character dynamics since the Bloodline. When you talk about Emmy writing or whatever, like, for any other form or facet of entertainment, we're judging it based on the strengths of what came before it, how things tie into everything, the strength of the characters, are they dynamic, and why can't I look at wrestling like that? Why would I disrespect wrestling like that? So I won't. It could be done better. We can have a bloodline level story all the time. That's not something that is once in a generation. That's just because these specific people decided, Roman, obviously, all, and Vince and whoever came and created with the character had a long-term goal and vision, right? This needs to be applied to every single person in WWE. I don't think it's, no. If WWE is WWE, everyone should feel like the top guy. I don't understand how they can kind of neglect, and for example, the tag team divisions, like they can essentially have them just facing exhibition matches on TV and not really further stories or feuds, like how do you expect people to care about a Viking Raiders if you never give them a reason to care about the Viking Raiders, for example? Like it's just an interesting time we're in right now. I know this is kind of more of a ranty one, but I do think that there needs to be some sort of just kind of going back to the drawing board after this Mania in terms of like how they want to present and tell stories, especially because in my opinion, I don't think it should be up to the superstars and individual segments to carry whole month-long feuds. You know what I mean? I do think, back like how we had in 2024, 2023. I can even give you another example with the whole Damage Control. Like you had multiple women and people involved in stories and they were all connected, and then after the fact things would happen that would then lead to other things. It felt logical, it felt like it made sense. You didn't have like an era where it is kind of like right now where people would just show up and go, oh hey, I want this, I want to challenge that, because that then takes the suspension of disbelief that we have for this out. Then you go, oh, so why did they do this, and from an outside perspective instead of analyzing the actual story and product that we're getting. And if they want people to stop being so like analytical, start booking and creating something that wouldn't derive those questions, and just create a story, focus on storytelling. Like all of the Unreal stuff, for example, like the way they go about in a board of, thinking of these certain things, it's never about the storytelling. It's about how can we get a pop, which is like, I like the same way that they want to say that the indies and everything is cheap for doing that. You all are doing the same thing in terms of your storytelling and your week-to-week booking by being this cheap. Just saying, but whatever. It's not like we're at Vince era anymore, but I do kind of think, there needs to be a reshuffling of the game plans moving forward, going past this 2026 Mania. I know that next year's Mania is going to be in Saudi Arabia, so we might not even really see that narrative like hook, because maybe they'll be keeping it in their back pocket for a year that they're not in Saudi, that they're somewhere where everyone else can, actually show up and go to the event. But we'll see. Let me know what you guys kind of thought about or think about right now, WWE, and if it's kind of peaked creatively in 2023 and 2024, and what can they do to kind of bring back, what they've lost, in those last couple of years.